Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another interview. That is part of our Changemakers series, where we will be profiling some of the leading phenomenal lawyers from across the world in hopes of getting their stories and sharing some of and getting them to share some of their insights with us. My name is Sfiso Benard. I am the president of the Oxford Law Black Alumni Network, and today I have the distinct privilege to be in conversation with someone that I consider to be absolutely brilliant, phenomenal, and a trailblazer of note. Justice Nicholls is a sitting judge at the Supreme Court of Appeal in South Africa, which is the second highest court in South Africa. She has an illustrious career that spans over some 30 years, and today she will be discussing some of her views and some of her thoughts and some of her life stories. Without wasting any further time, Justice Nicholls, welcome, and thank you for privileging us with your time.
Thanks, Sfiso. It's a privilege to be here, but I doubt if I've had a very illustrious career, but thank you for that. And I look forward to all your questions.
Thank you. So just to start us off at the beginning, so you started practicing during apartheid, as some people may call it. And for those people that don't know, apartheid was a very evil racial segregationist policy or system that was based on and perpetuated the fallacy and lie of white supremacy by privileging and creating spatial planning and economic opportunities that really benefited white people against the Black majority. It was declared a crime against humanity, and this was obviously unsurprising. But Justice Nicholls, just please take us through your career from that point and what your practice consisted of during such a horrible time, and what sort of cases were you involved in that you would like to share with us?
Well, I did my articles with a woman called Priscilla Jana, who is basically doing about, I would imagine, about 70% of all the political work in South Africa at that time. I mean, we're talking now about the early 80s, could have even been late 70s, but she was also banned, and a banning order at that time meant that a person was confined to their magisterial district and they couldn't meet with more than 2 people at a time. So what that meant was all the political prisoners were imprisoned in the Pretoria Central Prison, but she wasn't allowed to go there because she was confined to Joburg. So this meant that I was the one who was consulting with all the political prisoners in Pretoria until her banning order was slightly relaxed. For me, it was a great privilege. I was meeting freedom fighters who I admired enormously, who were risking their lives. I spent quite a lot of time on death row, which was, that is a story within itself. And that's the work we did. We basically did work of defending clients who were charged with high treason, terrorism, all nature. And then there were the local clients, the ones who hadn't left the country for military training, who were mostly charged with high treason. But I was involved in a particularly long treason trial. In fact, it's the longest trial in South African legal history, which was called the Delmas treason trial. And it sat on a daily basis from 1984 to 1989, I think it was. And that was really trying the internal organizations. The state had charged them with high treason and terrorism and furthering the aims of the ANC on the basis that by making the country ungovernable, as they said, i.e. by peaceful protests in the country against rent boycotts. Well, there was a rent boycott. There were what was called the tricameral parliament, which is South Africa's way of trying to get Indians and coloureds and whites into separate parliaments. And then, of course, Africans were meant to have a parliament in their own homeland, which brought another problem, and that was, of course, the problem of forced removals, because blacks then had to be moved out of the so-called white areas into their homeland areas. And that was where they were meant to govern and supposedly thrive. It really was an iniquitous system. But probably the strange thing about it all is that despite the system being so incredibly unjust and unfair, there was still a belief in the law, and the law was used in many circumstances. In fact, it always surprised me. I thought people would discard the law as a means of struggle completely, but they didn't. The law was used, and it was used with moderate success in some circumstances. Security legislation was challenged, emergency regulations was challenged. So that was my life. And of course, I was very privileged to have worked very closely with former Chief Justices, Arthur Chaskelson, Ismail Mohammed, and of course, George Bezos, who I considered as my father, quite frankly. So it was an extraordinarily difficult but fulfilling experience for me.
Mm. That's absolutely amazing, and I particularly am intrigued by the point that relates to how people believed in the law, even within a system that was inherently unjust and so problematic, but they still believed that they could, in some way or the other, maneuver and challenge and sort of get some form of freedoms and liberties. That is absolutely quite a fascinating thought. And perhaps this is just a little side note. One of the key legislation, well, maybe not key legislation, but one of the legislations that were passed under apartheid was the Immorality Act, if I'm not mistaken,
Yes.
Which Justice Nicholls, I don't know if you want to speak to it, because maybe you might have some experience.
Well, I may as well admit all. One of my clients in the Delmas treason trial, I finally married and had 3 children with. The Immorality Act was being, I think it was withdrawn, but there was still Group Areas Act. So we couldn't live together, in fact. It's a story for another day, but let's just say that my daughter was a frequent visitor to Robben Island. And in fact, she visited, I was the lawyer. The Delmas accused had been in jail for 4 years, and they were released on bail for a period of 6 months. And I managed to fall pregnant. So I went to, and then of course they were convicted. And my husband was then, he was found guilty of terrorism. All these acts of terrorism, I might add, were internal acts of protest, peaceful protest within the country. So the state was taking this to a new level, because treason before had been primarily reserved. I mean, there was an odd case, but primarily reserved for armed guerrillas, insurgents who'd come into the country. So this was one of the first really big cases where they put what was known as the UDF, the United Democratic Front, on trial. Anyway, he was found guilty together. There were 22 accused, and he was found guilty together with there are 5 of them. So he and 4 others. And my daughter was born. Then they were taken to Pretoria Central, and my daughter was born about 2 weeks after they were sentenced. I immediately went. 5 days after she was born, I went and I said, I'm the client and I need to see my clients. Mm. And they said, we flew them off to Robben Island last night. So I said, oh, well, then I will make sure I go to Robben Island. So I made an appointment. I went to Robben Island. George Bezos and Arthur Chaskelson were very kind, and they made sure that I was the one who did all the visits, the legal visits, because legal visits, you were entitled to have contact visits, where other visits, well, it was a long process, but also you had to do it between the glass. So Lindiwe and I got on the boat at the age of 10 days old, and she went over to Robben Island and saw her father. And the other accused, shall we call them, had to make sure that the prison warders didn't realize that who was the child, otherwise I wouldn't be allowed, who was the father, otherwise I wouldn't be allowed to continue visiting. So they made sure that it wasn't too obvious. And for those who've had mixed race children, they are born very, very pale. Straight black hair. In fact, if anything, she looked Chinese. Straight black hair and very pale. So the prison warders didn't have any idea that this was a mixed race child. But after a few months, 2 or 3 months, the skin goes brown and the hair curls, and then that was the end of my visits.
Well, thank you for sharing that story with us. That sort of does, it sheds a lot, and not just from a lawyer's perspective, but how inhumane apartheid was on a much more personal level. But thank you for that. So another question is, as a white person, you were obviously systematically privileged by apartheid, and you were not subjected necessarily to its inhumane policies. You were not the sort of subject or the sort of main point. So I'm curious as to what moved you to go into the direction of becoming a lawyer who acted against the state, when you could have just remained idle and sort of benefited from the status quo.
You know, many people ask me that question, and if I'm honest, I don't really know the answer. But we did do some diversity training at the SCA, and a story was related of a white primary school teacher who divided up children. She wanted to teach them about discrimination, and she divided them up into blue eyes and blue eyes and brown eyes. And she said one group was superior to the other. And I mean, interestingly enough, the superior group became very bossy. They became unpleasant to the inferior group. The inferior group performed academically far worse than they normally do. And the superior group performed far better than they normally did, which was very interesting to me. But that's not really the point of the story. The point of the story is that we were told that there was one child who said, but this is unfair. And the moral of the story is that there's always one person who says, but this is unfair. So rightly or wrongly, I think I'm that person who just thought, I don't really understand this, but this is unfair. Obviously, at university, I then became politicized and got involved in student politics, but it was just a feeling that this is fundamentally unfair. I had a hugely privileged life. I was the daughter of I grew up on a sugar plantation. So I really don't know why I turned out differently. And it's a question I'm often asked, and I never have the answer.
That is perfectly, that makes sense. Sometimes when something goes against your moral intuition, it doesn't have to be something that we sit down and understand from a very logical perspective, but it's more of a gut feel. So I think that absolutely makes a lot of sense. So perhaps just to maybe go back to your practice, I'm sure that there were sort of obstacles that you faced as a woman entering into the legal profession. And I'm curious as to what those obstacles were. And do you think that some of those obstacles exist today? Have you experienced any of them, even as a judicial person who now sits on the bench? Yeah.
Well, in the early days, quite frankly, the bigger obstacle was the kind of work we were doing. We were seen as terrorists, as our clients. And I think your sex was somewhat irrelevant in the legal profession. Of course, apartheid itself discriminated on gender grounds. And always at the bottom of the pack were, of course, black women. But in my work, it was more, these communists, these terrorists are here to defend their clients. So we were treated very badly. And I found it quite easy to get into that work because, quite frankly, no one wanted to do it. It was dangerous. It was unpopular. It wasn't going to make you money. So in those early days, apart from the structural inequalities of gender and racism, personally, I didn't feel that I suffered any greater inequalities than I would have been if I'd been a man. We were just lumped together as the terrorist lawyers, the communist lawyers. I think it was only a bit later when I started, when I was on the Law Society and I was on the Gender Committee of the Law Society, and there was this disproportionate number of students who were female students who were entering the legal profession. And in fact, all the merit exams, were won by women. But once they got into the profession, they seemed to just hit a glass ceiling. They couldn't go any further. And there were there's so many reasons for that. I mean, a patriarchal society is a patriarchal society. As someone said, it's the only non-racial institution in South Africa. Patriarchy. It also has the halo of culture, for example. You know, if you try and challenge male dominance, you know, you're not fighting white privilege, you're undermining African values, or you're destroying Afrikaner ideals or British civilization. You know, it's such a patriarchy is such a multifaceted problem in our society. My way of dealing with it in practice actually is we had an all-women's firm eventually that carried on doing political work. We only employed women. Yes, we did. Yes, there was discrimination. How much of that was because we were women, or how much of that is because we were doing work that was unpopular? You know, my law partner was gay, so she took on all those early cases of at the Constitutional Court of the abolition of sodomy. You know, same-sex rights for same-sex partners, medical aid, etc., etc. So in my work environment, I had a very protected work environment in that I was surrounded by women. I was surrounded by like-minded, strong women, and that's how I survived. I mean, there are a few sort of notable instances with the courts. For example, there was a woman who was a client and she wanted a divorce. She was actually, in fact, at that time, head of the Gender Commission of the ANC, having just come into the country, and she wanted to divorce her husband, and the white male judge refused to grant her a divorce until she had changed her name to his name, although she had never, ever taken his name. Anyway, we lodged a complaint, and finally the divorce went through. But she was obliged to change her name in order for the divorce to go through. So they're constant instances of sexism. In the judiciary, of course, yeah, well, what can I say? I'm sure, Sfiso, you've seen that women judges are treated with, they patronized, basically.
Yeah.
Female judges are patronized, and if you're a Black female judge, you're patronized even more. That's just the reality. You know, and yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct, because I think, you know, when I was clerking at the Constitutional Court, sometimes you'd see when counsel, well, firstly, you saw it in the sort of counsel that came, was that generally the counsel that came before you were either white males, generally, particularly when it came to supposedly complex commercial matters or matters that require some form of intellectualism that white people are said to inherently possess.
Yes, white males, mind you. Only white males inherently possess that intellectualism, I must say.
Yeah, so you saw that, and it was very, I think what was shocking for me was that in my time there was no Black senior counsel who was a woman who came to present any arguments. They mostly came as juniors, and most times, it's what they would call token counsel,
Yes.
where they're just there for to actually just get the briefs, the government briefs that require them to have at least one Black counsel on there. And then obviously on the bench, it was also the same way. The Black female judges and the women judges were just generally interrupted, or they couldn't finish their particular question, or sometimes they were rubbished as, what a simple question that you're asking me. And, you would just tell that the tone changed. So I absolutely agree. I think that, being part of being at the bench or being part of the judiciary doesn't make you immune from this patriarchal system. You will still face the same stereotypes and the same issues. And perhaps
that's certainly true. It's exactly true of the SCA, which of course has smaller panels. We only have 5 panels as opposed to, well, what should be 11. 11-person panel on the Concord, but is increasingly less so these days. Yes, the women judges weren't taken particularly seriously, often by counsel and often by their fellow judges, quite frankly. And very few Black women counsel have appeared in the SCA. Increasingly, there are more Black male counsel, but very few Black women counsel and very few women counsel altogether. And, we still our own worst enemies, because we do when a white male counsel appears before you, he doesn't have to prove his excellence. In fact, if anything, he has to show, if he's bad, he has to show that he's bad despite being white and male. Yeah. But if a Black woman judge, the starting point is she is inferior, and therefore she's got to prove her brilliance. She starts off at such a disadvantage to the white male compatriot.
Sure. I absolutely understand that. And what do you think can be done for us to sort of start moving beyond those obstacles? Are there any structural changes that we need to start speaking of? What is the role of transformation? And personally, if you were to be introspective, what are your own transformative ideologies or sort of systems that you have undertaken?
The only thing I can ever think of is mentoring, because it's the one thing that gives people confidence. White males and maybe Black males, I can't speak for them, but they seem to be born with an innate confidence that everything they say is fabulous and wonderful and correct. Whereas I think women immediately they second guess themselves. Did I do the right thing? Have I performed well? We second guess ourselves. So it's a very good, I think a mentoring system is the only thing that can work. I mean, on a broader level, it's a societal problem. I mean, and it's not just in South Africa. It's the world over. As they say, if to become a judge, you need a good husband. You need a good wife. Sure. You're going to need a good wife who'll support you, who'll encourage you, who'll sort out everything at home. And, women don't have good wives, generally speaking. I mean, some do, but generally they don't.
That's what you mean. And so I think generally our conversations in law and the legal fraternity really revolves around race and gender, and rightfully so, as sort of factors that limit one's potential and one's ability to go up the sort of leather, the
Yeah.
judicial career path, whatever.
Yeah.
But I'm curious as to, as a judge, what do you think an intersectional approach brings to the table when it comes to the adjudication of socioeconomic issues or socioeconomic rights? What does that add to the jurisprudence of the courts?
I think an intersectional approach is vital, because you've got to understand who holds power and why they hold power in society, or why they don't hold power. And I think it's actually vital, and I think the Concord has in fact kind of accepted that in that judgment on domestic workers.
Yeah,
the Mahlangu jump, where they used an intersectional approach as an interpretive tool, and said that this, and the fact that domestic workers were the most oppressed and the lowest of the rung, and were kind of on the intersectionality between woman, gender, race oppression, was taken into consideration. And I think that the more one understands that racism and gender are pervasive and they're structural, they're not the individual idiosyncrasies of one prejudiced person. There's a pervasively structural system that goes back centuries that informs racism and sexism. And I think an intersectional approach at least tries to take cognizance of this and tries to understand where people come from. Obviously the fact that we're trying to make our judiciary more diverse should also assist in that. The more varied the backgrounds that people come from, the more they should be able to bring their own experiences to the table, and a greater understanding of what informs power structures in society.
So speaking of sort of socioeconomic issues, do you think that we could resolve socio-political issues through the law only without political will? And when I speak of socioeconomic issues in this particular instance, I'm referring to things like land reform, healthcare issues, and housing issues. Can we just merely point to a constitution or legislation, or do we need a government that is, fully behind that project and behind that idea?
We absolutely need a government that's fully behind the project and behind the idea. The constitution or law on its own will do nothing. And you're well aware of this whole debate on the politicization of the judiciary, or the judicialization of politics, whatever it is, however you want to put it. Sure. But basically, politicians are abdicating their role to courts. Decisions which are political, or even socio-economic or whatever, are being abdicated to the courts. It causes a great it causes a problem for the judiciary, because it then impacts on how biased are we, how unbiased are we? Are we independent arbitrators of the facts, especially when factional politics play themselves out. Basically, it impacts on what the public perception of the independence of the judiciary, because the judiciary is not there to solve parties' political problems and political fights. Initially, when one looks at the cases and the constitutions that appeared before the constitution, one almost felt that the government was in partnership with the courts for the realization of a transformational society. But increasingly, as things went awry in the country, they became, and there was misgovernance and corruption and abuse of power. You had the courts in conflict with the state, and the state became sort of the bulwark against malfeasance by the government. And it's very different, I think, from how the Constitutional Court started off, which really did strike me as more of a partnership. We're in this together. We're trying to build a democratic society. We're trying to build a society where socio-economic rights will be realized within time. Instead, there's now this very confrontational attitude, and courts can't do it. The courts can't do it. The law, the courts will follow when there's a political will, the courts will follow.
I mean, that makes absolute sense, particularly if one views the fact that, institutionally courts are not really meant to be deciding certain issues about budgets. And, I'm thinking about Mwelase, for instance.
Yes.
Issues that pertain to institutional knowledge and budgets and distribution of power and how to actually implement certain policies. The courts are not structurally and institutionally built for that, and they don't have the constituency and the sort of purse to really follow through. And I absolutely think that's absolutely correct. So, I think there you said that the state was a bulwark against the government. I think you meant the courts were a bulwark against the government.
Sorry, the courts were a bulwark against government malfeasance and corruption. Yeah. And they're now seeing as this, the courts are the expression of the moral outrage of what people see as corruption and misuse of state funds, etc., etc. So it does place it, and it places the judiciary in a very difficult position. And I think that this is probably one of the most difficult times that the judiciary has gone through. And I think it's largely due to the politicization of the judiciary as a result of the cases that are brought to it. And I think it's largely a result of the dysfunction of political parties. That courts are being used to determine political battles as opposed to legal battles.
Absolutely. And I mean, I know that there are really some scholars who might argue that, once something becomes constitutionalized, or once you have a constitution in place and you allow for judicial review, then you're opening up the floodgates for these political issues. But I think what you're pointing at really is that there seems to be a tension between the state and the courts, and where there seems to be a lack of willpower in carrying out any constitutional promise by the state. And in fact, there's the opposite. It's not just a lack of achieving something, but it's actively detracting from it.
Yes.
And really now that causes this sort of tension. And we can't expect Mam Dlamini to now say, I'm going to wait for the government to resolve this, when they know that they could run to court and they could actually just get a court order. And that places the courts in a very uncomfortable position, where they realize sometimes that we might not have this particular power, but also we do have to address some of these issues and, come in and sort of solve them.
Yes, completely. I mean, and it's a failure of government, unfortunately. I think the politicization of the courts has been a failure of government. I mean, of course, from the outset, we know that all public power is subject to constitutional scrutiny, but it's gone to great extremes that I don't think the drafters of the Constitution ever imagined, but I could be wrong. But it really does seem to have gone overboard.
Sure. I mean, and I think you've really also answered my other follow-up question, which was really about the judicialization of politics and the politicalization of the judiciary or courts, and really. And I think you're right that there is some real danger to this, that we now might find ourselves in a place where courts end up making decisions that they're not best placed to sort of make.
Well, I think it puts in the eyes of the public, it makes courts political, and courts are not meant to be political. They're meant to be unbiased. They're meant to make unbiased decisions. And whereas now the public perception is they're part of a faction. The courts are not considered to be part of a faction. When they find against a certain faction in government, or when they find against government, or they consider to be pro-opposition parties if the opposition party brings a case. So I think it's a difficult time for the South African judiciary. You know, I was trying to think of a comparison in Britain, and I don't know if there is one, but it's almost like if what's his name, Dominic Cummings was fired by Johnson, as far as I understand. And, it would be unthinkable in Britain if he were to challenge his dismissal in a court, whereas in South Africa, that happens all the time.
Quite frequent, yeah. Yeah, it is. It absolutely is. I mean, we might be going more towards the American system now of the Supreme Court, which is in my mind, it's quite an active political player, even though it shouldn't be. And I find discomfort in it being a political player, but it really, really is.
Well, it's an active political player, but it's also the political parties choose their judges. I mean, I think we were hoping that judges are political appointees.
Just to wrap us up, what do you think is the importance of movements like the Me Too movement or the Black Lives Matter movement? What do you think is their contribution and significance, maybe broadly in just society and also in the legal fraternity?
I think they're very important. I think they've mainstreamed the recognition of racism and gender violence as pervasive and structural. I think it's made people realize that this is not some sort of lunatic fringe, that this really is, it's mainstreamed it. People have to acknowledge sexual harassment, gender-based violence. They've got to acknowledge racism. And it's given people courage to speak out. And, racism, I think, is more easy to call out. But, the fact that it's taken, I don't know how many years for people to speak out about people like Harvey Weinstein, for example. I mean, it takes, it's difficult. It's invaluable. In my view, the Me Too movement is invaluable. To society and to the courts, because we have to acknowledge that these things exist. One denies discrimination, or one tries to get away with discrimination by underplaying it, denying its existence, and just diverting our attention from it. And I think what the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement have placed it squarely on the agenda. You cannot look away now. You've got to face it, and you've got to deal with it instead of centuries of sweeping it under the carpet.
No, absolutely. Fully agree with you. That'll be it for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your time. I know that this is time that you could have spent doing whatever judges do, which is probably reading books and whatever else. So
whatever else.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope that you found this a little bit insightful. Until we speak again, or until we meet again, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sfiso.